Welcome to the Harvard School of Public Health training on using exercises to enhance and measure preparedness. In the last 10 years or so, there's been a dramatic increase, I think, in the use of exercises in public health and in healthcare to both improve preparedness and to measure preparedness. And today we're going to talk about the specifics of how those exercises can be used. Also in the last 10 years, there's been a tremendous increase in the amount of guidance that has come from the federal government and others about how to design, conduct, and evaluate exercises. And for some folks, that can be a bit overwhelming. Today, we're going to try and distill some of that down to a more manageable level so that hopefully at the end of this session, you'll feel more comfortable conducting and evaluating your own exercise program. Today, we're going to talk about 5 basic topics. First, talk about what exercises are. There actually is some controversy about what constitutes an exercise, and we'll discuss that. Talk about the purpose. There are actually multiple competing purposes for using exercises in preparedness, and I think it's important to explicitly recognize the trade-offs among the different purposes. Talk about the process of designing, conducting, and evaluating exercises, which really is very important to understand well. I think the difference between going through the exercise process correctly and going through it incorrectly makes all the difference in terms of the experience your participants have and in terms of the data that you can gather from an exercise. We will talk a fair amount about evaluation, since evaluation of performance is so important in exercising. And we will name some common pitfalls that are pretty frequently seen when folks conduct emergency preparedness exercises. So let's start with the basics. What are preparedness exercises? Again, there's actually some controversy about this, but the federal government defines them as any event after the planning process that gathers people to either test or improve preparedness. And again, sometimes this includes things that don't necessarily seem like exercises, which we'll talk about in the next 2 slides. But basically, it's easier to divide preparedness exercises up into 2 giant buckets to figure out what we're talking about. The first is discussion-based, where you take people, bring them together either physically around a table or virtually, and have them discuss what they might be doing when faced with a certain scenario. And then the other broad type is operations-based, and that's where people actually start doing some of the activities that they would actually do in response to a real emergency event. And if you think about exercises in those 2 buckets of discussion-based and operation-based, it's easier, I think, to understand what you're actually talking about. Broadly speaking, there are 3 kinds of discussion-based exercises, though you could break these down into subtypes. The first is seminars and workshops. And again, as I mentioned before, some people have some concerns about whether these are called exercises, but within the federal scheme, they certainly qualify. And these are things that should be conducted early in the exercise process. And what they are meant to do is enhance training in specific emergency plans or procedures so that as people progress through the exercise process, they are well trained, well familiar with what they're supposed to be doing in the more complicated or higher level functioning portions of the exercise. So seminars and workshops count as an exercise, but really are meant to familiarize your participants with the things that they need to know to progress through the exercise program. Tabletop exercises are really the most common type of discussion-based exercise, and most people have participated in at least one, if not many, tabletop exercises. They are what they sound like, which is people sit around a table and discuss their response plans to a given threat scenario. And they're incredibly useful. They give personnel the opportunity to walk through a plan or multiple plans to discuss potential obstacles and pitfalls. They're very helpful for identifying gaps or conflicts and problems, and we'll talk much more about them as we progress through this talk. Tabletops, again, are really the most common discussion-based exercise. Somewhat less common, but of some potential, are games. And games are simulations of some sort that are usually a hybrid of some discussion and simulated actions. And the beauty of a game is that depending on the technology involved, you can show people potential consequences of their actions or of their decisions. And so in contrast, to a tabletop exercise, oftentimes what you will see is that people can see how they affect morbidity or mortality, or how they affect throughput, or how they affect another outcome, because the game will give them a computerized amount of feedback on the decisions that they made. So games are thought to be of great potential because they help the user figure out what the right decision is by giving them concrete data that shows them the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of a decision that they voiced. Because games require often quite a bit of technology, because they oftentimes have to be very specific to local environments or to local emergency plans, a lot of games still remain somewhat unrealized in terms of their full potential, but there are a lot of good people working on this, and most people expect the area of games to only increase in the exercise world in preparedness. This is just a screenshot of a tabletop exercise, and again, it looks like what it sounds like, which is people are sitting around a table representing different agencies, different constituencies, talking about what they would be doing in response to an emergency event. And I think it's a good way to show why these things are useful. If you see, it looks like there's a couple law enforcement, maybe some fire representatives, maybe some public health and hospital representatives around this table. You can see how they will be talking about what they each would be doing in terms of their own agency or department response. And frequently in this setting is when we uncover conflicts or gaps where one department is expecting another department to do a certain action, and it's only during this exercise that we realize that those expectations are not realistic or not appropriate. In contrast to discussion-based exercises, operation-based exercises start to get people to do what they would actually do during an emergency. And broadly speaking, there are three kinds of operation-based exercises. The most simple operation-based exercise is a drill. And a drill is a specific test of one thing and one thing only. So you can have a drill to use a fire extinguisher and prove that everyone can use a fire extinguisher. You can have a call-down drill where you test your ability to call all of your off-duty staff and see if you can reach them in time. You can have a fire drill where you see if you can evacuate the building in response to the fire alarm. But a drill is a very simple test of one kind of equipment or one piece of your plan. If it gets more complicated than one component that you're testing, then it's no longer a drill. In contrast, there are really functional and full-scale exercises in the operations-based realm that are much, much more commonly used. Functional exercises are really used to test communications, command, and control. And what they are is people working within their ordinary places of work. And so, in other words, for a tabletop exercise, you bring people away from their place of work to all sit around the same table, which is not generally realistic. They don't get to sit together when they really respond to a real-world event. In a functional exercise, they stay where they would normally be. So the fire leadership is at the fire department, the hospital leadership is at the hospital, the public health department leadership is at the public health department. And yet you still have to see how they would respond together to an emergency incident using radios, computers, telephones, whatever communications equipment they would have. So emergency operations centers are frequently used in functional exercises because they play such a prominent role in communications and other incident support. But the purpose of a functional exercise really is to test situational awareness, to test command and control, and is very, very helpful because, as most everyone knows, it's those communications, command and control issues that frequently cause some of the most problems in actual incident response. The most complicated, most difficult to achieve exercise is the full-scale exercise, and that is where you simulate the full event itself. And so in field operations, people simulate treating victims that wear moulage or makeup to look like real injuries, where real ambulances and police cars and fire trucks and hazardous materials trucks actually move around, or in hospitals, people simulating victims really get treatment in bays in the emergency department or CAT scan, or go upstairs to the operating room. Or in public health, people move around to simulate real investigation or lab response, other parts of the public health response structure. So because these things involve real people moving around, doing real duties as part of the emergency response, it's the most complicated. But it's also the one that hopefully helps you simulate your response as close to reality as you can come without actually having to have the emergency response. Because of the complexity involved in designing and conducting a full-scale exercise, it is indeed the most difficult to do and probably the most uncommon of exercises that are conducted, but certainly they still have a tremendous amount of utility. This is an example of an airport full-scale exercise. Airports are required to do full-scale exercises every 2 years, and so they often are the center of some community emergency exercises. But again, you can see the complexity involved in closing a runway, in taking a car and turning it over to simulate a disaster, to get volunteer victims to sign up as pretend victims for the exercise. It requires quite a bit of effort. So how does this all fit together? Well, there is a recommended building block approach that you don't just start at a full-scale exercise with all of its complexity and cost and see what you can learn. Instead, really, you're supposed to build from the less complicated to the more complicated so that you learn lessons as you go. Again, seminars and workshops, discussions-based exercises are meant to be the foundation of a good tabletop exercise so that when you bring people together around a table to discuss their plans, they are very familiar with their plans. They've talked through some of the basic complications or misunderstandings that could be identified in a workshop, and ideally the tabletop is as useful as it can be because everyone knows what they would do in their plan. They're very familiar with their own agency's, our own institution's response. After the discussion-based exercises, you move into the operations-based exercises, and ideally a tabletop exercise should precede a functional or a full-scale exercise so that you can pre-identify any problems that might derail a functional or a full-scale exercise before you go to all the trouble of conducting one of those. The dark orange boxes here, the tabletop, functional, and full-scale, really are the fundamental components of an exercise program. Ideally, you are constantly planning one and the next. So you're planning your tabletop to be able to help your functional helps your full scale learns lessons, you revise your plans, and then you go back and conduct another tabletop. You don't always have to go from a tabletop to a functional to a full scale. It is common for folks to do a tabletop and then a full scale, or a tabletop and then a functional and then stop. But generally speaking, some sort of discussion-based exercise should precede an operations-based exercise to make sure the operations-based exercise is as effective as it can be. So now that we've defined what we think exercises are, the question really is why do exercises in the first place? And they're done typically for two main reasons, and there's some theoretical conflict between these reasons. The first reason is to train staff, and it's very hard for many staff to know what to do in an emergency unless they practice it in a fictional setting, and that's really what an exercise is. So you train your staff to work in uncommon disaster situations. You bring different people who wouldn't work together. So if there's on-scene decontamination happening at a hospital and the fire department and the hospital staff don't usually work together, an exercise is a very good way to bring them together. And really, a lot of people have found that this is more durable learning, that if people learn what the plan is, learn what their response is by doing it, that it sticks in their brain much better than if they sit in front of a lecture hall and hear about the plan or hear it explained to them. Now, this is in conflict with what is really the recommended purpose of exercises based on the federal dogma, which is to test your plans and test your preparedness. Obviously, it's very hard to measure preparedness when you're training staff because they're not as familiar with the plan as they need to be to represent how the plan is effective during the exercise. So testing preparedness is really the primary recommended use of exercises, and the point is to, again, uncover any gaps between plans or conflicts between plans or unintended consequences of plans that really can only be found when you execute the plan. In the real world, again, most agencies, most institutions have new staff, have junior staff who have not been through emergencies or emergency exercises before, and start to be involved in an emergency preparedness exercise as part of their training, that really raises questions and problems for how well you can test preparedness using exercises. And we'll continue to say a lot about that. But from a purely theoretical standpoint, you should try and have your staff as well trained as possible with pre-exercise initiatives before you begin to test during an exercise. But looking at it a different way, you can also look at why you have exercises at the individual and at the systems level. And even if you ignore the contradiction between education and evaluation for exercises that we discussed in the previous slide, at the individual level, it's still helpful to conduct an exercise to improve staff members' familiarity with their disaster plans and procedures through hands-on practice. Again, they will uncover things that they didn't know or that they need to do differently as they actually practice their response. And each staff member can improve his or her performance through constructive critiques of their actions. Did they make the right leadership decisions? Did they conduct the right actions that were either appropriate within the emergency management plan or not? And so exercises definitely have an individual level measurement capability to help improve individual staff members' performance. But also, really, exercises are very important on a system-wide level, and that's primarily how the measurement of most exercises is targeted, and that's to reveal gaps in resources. What did you think you have, or that you were going to need that you didn't have access to? Where is your plan weak? What haven't you thought about? What haven't you anticipated? And where is there a lack of clarity about roles and responsibilities? Particularly in tabletop exercises, it's very common to identify conflicting assumptions about roles and responsibilities that should be clarified before a real event were to happen. So once you've decided why you're having exercises and you're setting the goals for your exercise program, it's really important to pay attention to the exercise process itself. Most people have been part of both good and bad exercises and have significant comments about each. But I think it's pretty obvious that the quality of an exercise has a lot of ripple effects throughout your entire preparedness program. First off, if participants have a bad experience, they can easily become demotivated and not be very enthusiastic about participating in future exercises. It also affects the ability to train participants. If you have a bad exercise and you were trying to have some part of that exercise improve the training of your staff, a bad exercise may miss that opportunity, or worse yet, allow them to learn bad behaviors that you don't want to reinforce during disaster response. So at the individual participant level, you really miss an opportunity to motivate people to be excited about improving emergency response and preparedness. And also, again, you miss an opportunity to train them in their roles or have them learn the correct behaviors. But also, really, if an exercise is conducted badly, it really limits what you can learn from the exercise about your own plans and procedures. A bad test gives you bad data, and it's very hard to know how to interpret the data of an exercise if it's not conducted realistically, if it's not conducted well. And again, I think the real challenge is that it thwarts the whole purpose of having an exercise if it doesn't go well. So it then, therefore, hopefully follows that careful attention to following the right steps of the exercise process correctly will help you get your money's worth. We all know that exercises are expensive, both in terms of time and money, and take a fair amount of effort from exercise planners to design, conduct, and evaluate. So if you're going to take the effort to spend time and money, have an exercise, you really want to do it to learn the best lessons that you can. So the exercise process itself really is a cycle, like many things within preparedness. But there is a federal framework that the government suggests for exercise design, conduct, and evaluation that is pretty helpful. And I think if you see here, there is the HSEEP exercise process described in the graphic. We'll go through this in detail, but I think it's quite helpful to think about. HSEEP, as we'll say in the next slide, is the Homeland Security Exercise Evaluation Program. It really is the United States federal dogma for how we should be designing, conducting, and evaluating exercises. But you'll notice, as I keep saying, design, conduct, and exercise, that's part of the project management of how you conduct exercises. But there really is, hand in hand with the project management of exercises, an entirely parallel and important process of program management, which is to say that exercises need to fit into your overall emergency management program, and you have to be able to take the lessons learned from evaluation of exercise performance and turn those into improvement items that get incorporated into plan, policy, procedure improvements, so that you don't simply learn lessons that never get addressed in the real world. Instead, exercises identify problems that get fixed and therefore drive improvement forward. So as I mentioned, HSEEP is an acronym that most people are familiar with. It's the Homeland Security Exercise Evaluation Program, and the website is listed here on the slide. From their website, the description is pretty good. It says that it's a capabilities and performance-based exercise program that provides a standardized methodology and terminology for exercise design, development, conduct, evaluation, and improvement planning. And there are a couple important things to highlight in there. One is that HSEEP really tries to get participants to look at the capabilities that are expected of them during a response. So if you are a fire department, as an example, you need to have the capability of putting out fires. And so your exercises really should focus on that capability. If you are a public health department, your capability of investigating an infectious disease outbreak should be tested in an appropriate exercise. And this is different than testing individual people or how good they are at their job. It really is looking at a higher level at the agency's performance of appropriate emergency capabilities. HSEEP has evolved tremendously in the last 10 years and continues to be refined and move forward. And there is an entire group of folks within the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, within the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, that look at HSEEP to both translate it out for daily practitioner use, but also help improve the system, because we're continually learning lessons of how to do this better. Anyone who's been around exercises for even a little while has probably heard the term HSEEP Compliance thrown around. And although everyone seems to talk about HSEEP Compliance, and it's certainly required when conducting exercises using federal money, very few people really understand what HSEEP Compliance really means. And again, I think it's used in a colloquial fashion to justify lots of different kinds of behaviors or actions. But if you really kind of try and boil it down to what does it mean to have an HSEEP compliant exercise, it's these 6 things. The first is that your exercises have to be part of a multi-year progressive training and exercise program. What does that mean? That means that you shouldn't have one-off exercises that just address unrelated capabilities and really don't fit together in any sort of constructive or progressive way. In other words, having a hazmat exercise, then having an evacuation exercise, then having a flu exercise, then having a bus crash exercise, and not having any link among them that tries to look at common capabilities or lessons learned so that you progress in your improvements as you assess and refine your capabilities doesn't make sense. Your exercise program should certainly be targeted at your hazard vulnerability analysis, and those things that you think are your biggest challenges that you are targeting your improved planning to address should also be part of your exercises. And so as you improve your hurricane planning, say if you were in a hurricane-prone area, you would want to ultimately test that hurricane plan to make sure that your improvements are on the right track. And then as you test and learn lessons and refine that plan, you would want to retest again to make sure that further refinements make sense. So you can't do this all in 1 year. Of course, this all takes a long time and a lot of money to make it work correctly. So again, HSEEP requires you have a multi-year progressive training and exercise program that links your activities together so that you're building on the lessons learned, building on previous activities, not simply conducting a number of uncoordinated or unrelated exercises. HSEEP does require that participants in the exercises use the National Incident Management System, NIMS, and the Incident Command System, ICS. And that's probably pretty straightforward and pretty much assumed by most people. But if you have an exercise that does not use those leadership structures, it would not be HSEEP compliant. Again, as I mentioned already, the exercise program should be linked to your hazard vulnerability analysis, and so that hazard vulnerability analysis should be what's driving your jurisdictional priorities. And we should be looking at the capabilities required to respond to the threats in your HVA. So that scenario has to be appropriate for things that are on your HVA. If you are in rural Iowa, probably a massive subway sarin attack doesn't make sense if there is no actual subway, and if you don't think that a sarin attack is very likely in rural Iowa. The scenario should be much more likely based on the priorities, the threats, and the plans that are most relevant to you in your area. To be HSEEP compliant, an exercise should support regional planning. Again, everyone's probably heard about how much we're trying to break down silos of individual organizations or individual entities planning on their own without relation to their partners. To be HSEEP compliant, you should ideally involve your regional partners in your exercise as much as possible. Every exercise needs an after-action report. We'll talk more about after-action reports later, but these are descriptions of what happened during the exercise. You can't simply conduct the exercise, not have a structured evaluation, not produce a report of what happened, because, of course, that misses the opportunity to learn lessons from the exercise. And the last part of being HSEEP compliant is that you have to have an improvement plan. And that simply is recognizing that it's one thing to write down the problems that you saw during an exercise. It's an entirely different thing to start to make improvements that address those problems. And exercises aren't meant to be conducted simply to name problems. They're meant to be conducted to name problems that will be fixed, that will be addressed. So again, we're always driving performance forward. Now, just because an exercise is HSEEP compliant does not necessarily mean it's going to be successful. There are a lot of other things that really have to be considered if you're going to have a successful exercise. And we've tried to list 9 of them here. They really, really are important, and I would encourage you all to think about these anytime you're planning an exercise or an exercise program. First off, exercises have to have support from leaders and participants. An exercise that is poorly funded or doesn't have the support of leadership frequently won't have the right attendees at the table, won't have sufficient funding, won't have sufficient support, and ends up, again, being unrealistic or too watered down to be useful. Exercises have to have a realistic timetable, meaning you have to take enough time to plan the exercise, to hold the exercise, and to evaluate the exercise to learn lessons. It is very common for people to try and hold an exercise 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks in the future, and for most agencies, for most purposes, that's just not sufficient time to make sure all of the details of exercise planning are well attended to. And something hastily done usually goes pretty badly. The goals of an exercise have to be realistic and specific. It's unfortunately very common as you get into bigger municipal exercises that they start putting more and more and more goals into the exercise because they have more and more people that want to participate. So you have the airport exercise that starts to need to be a fire department and a hazmat and a hospital and an infectious disease and a vulnerable populations and a sheltering exercise. And you have blind, irradiated dogs landing with non-English speaking staff that are homeless and need every social service imaginable. And ultimately, of course, what happens if you layer too many goals and objectives onto the exercise, it achieves none of them. Scenarios should be clear. The ground rules for participation should be clear. Every exercise is a fiction, of course, and if the ground rules don't encourage people to believe in the fiction, to believe in the simulation, it's very easy for some participants to start finding fault with the exercise, and instead of playing with the scenario, they fight the scenario. Exercises should have sustained action as much as possible, even though A lot of disaster response is really hurry up and wait, where you have bursts of action and then periods of lull in the middle. It's harder to conduct exercises that way because what you do is lose the interest of your participants. You have to be realistic. I've said this before a couple ways, but if the participants sense that the scenario really isn't realistic for them, isn't something that they plausibly might have to deal with, again, they tend to become disengaged or not participate very fully in the exercise. Every exercise, because it's an emergency simulation, because it involves personnel with real emergency response duties, has to have safety procedures behind it to call off the exercise, either if there is a simultaneous real-world emergency event or if something goes wrong during the exercise. I have hopefully stressed already, but I will stress more times through this discussion, that evaluation is critical, and you have to have a well-thought-out, well-structured evaluation plan as part of your exercise plan, or there's not much point in conducting the exercise. And all of this really can be summed up in the sense that exercises have to facilitate positive change. If you don't design the exercise well, if you don't motivate participants, and if you don't evaluate it well so that you learn lessons, an exercise isn't going to facilitate positive change and therefore is really going to end up being a waste of time and money. So when you're setting objectives, to avoid competing objectives, as we talked about in the last slide, you really should limit yourself to about 5, certainly no more than 10, specific, measurable, realistic objectives for each exercise. Objectives should be as specific as possible. Simply improve our plan is not an appropriate objective. It needs to be something along the lines of testing how quickly you can communicate the existence of a train crash in the community to all the relevant responders. That would be a much more specific way to phrase an objective, and would be one important thing you could test during an exercise. Listed on this slide are some categories of exercise objectives, but none of them is an objective in and of itself. 5 is really a good number of exercise objectives. If you start to get too many more than 5, again, you dilute out the scenario, you dilute out your chance to learn useful lessons. Once you've set your objectives, and again, setting objectives is absolutely the first part of an exercise planning process because you have to know what you're trying to achieve. Then you start to think about setting a scenario and sequence of events that will help you test those objectives. For those that don't have the right content expertise to develop a scenario, it's very much recommended to use content experts to assist in scenario development. It's very common, unfortunately, for people to create infectious disease scenarios that really just aren't plausible, or explosions that really just don't cause the kind of damage that is being discussed. So you have to have the right content experts, again, so your scenario is realistic. You should try and do your homework, do research, gather background information, know what the issues are in your community, know what the buildings are, what the traffic routes are like, what the weather situation might be, so that your scenario is as plausible as possible. Again, the test needs to look like reality so that you learn useful lessons. Once the scenario is drafted, take it back to the exercise planning team, who ideally represents most or all of the participants in the exercise, so that they can give their comments and feedback. If the scenario either causes too great or too little challenge to one of the participants, you might lose their interest during the exercise, and it might not be the useful test that you're hoping it will be. And the best way really to do that is to do a talk through of the scenario. And again, that's where you'll hear back whether you're on target with what you've drafted or whether you need to give more or less action to a certain participant or group of participants. Then ultimately, once you've done the talk through, you can finalize the scenario and really think about injects, which are the specific pieces of information you give to the participants that simulate the real world, and think of them as sort of lines from a play. They're the data that the participants receive to react to drive their actions during the exercise. After you have planned the exercise, you've set objectives, you've got all the right people at the table to discuss what you want to do with the exercise, you've written a scenario that supports achieving those objectives, that you've talked through the scenario and refined it to make sure that it does indeed have enough substance to allow all the participants to achieve the objectives, it's time to, of course, conduct the exercise. And executing a successful exercise really depends on being detail-oriented in the planning process. It's very labor-intensive. You have to, of course, get all the right participants to show up at the exercise, but you need lots of other people as well. You certainly need controllers and facilitators. You need people who are going to moderate and manage the flow of information, the pace of exercise play, so that you keep control of the exercise yourself as the exercise lead, and you don't let people wander off onto tangents. If it's a full-scale exercise, you need volunteers or victims to simulate patients or to simulate different people in the exercise. It can be hard or time-consuming to recruit these volunteers and victims, and they require some coaching. You need dedicated evaluators. You need people who know what they're looking for and are supplied with the right evaluation tools to accurately observe play, to make sure that the exercise, again, is providing you with all the data that you need. And lastly, you need support personnel who are going to help support the exercise. It may be traffic control. It may be providing a little food and coffee. It may be folks who are otherwise just overseeing the entire exercise process to make sure that the needs of the controllers, facilitators, volunteers, and evaluators are being met. But again, it's often a labor-intensive process. In addition to the people that we mentioned, there also are several documents that the HSEEP program recommends to support an exercise. First off is the situation manual. People call it the SITMAN. And what it really is a handbook for discussion-based exercises. And a situation manual is kind of like the notes when you go to see a play that give you the background, that give you enough context to be able to understand what you're about to do. It does not, of course, give you the scenario itself, but it gives the background that will lead into the exercise scenario and allows all the participants to come together to play well. In contrast to a SITMAN, which is meant for discussion-based exercises, you have the X-Plan or exercise plan for operations-based exercises. And similarly, it is a handbook that lets the participants know what to expect and what to do. But particularly if it's an operations-based exercise, it has more discussion about safety and call-off procedures so that as people are going about their actions during the exercise, they know when they would need to stop or how they would need to ask for help if something were to go wrong. Neither the SITMAN nor the X-Plan has the facts of the exercise simulation in it because those are meant to be a surprise as they go through the exercise. But instead, the Controller Evaluator Handbook and the Master Scenario Events List do have the scenario in them. The Master Scenario Events List really is the script of the play. It's the list chronologically of the events, actions, injects that are going to be given to the players. And it's what all controllers, all evaluators, all facilitators have so that they know what's about to happen during the exercise in front of them. The Controller Evaluator Handbook has components of the master scenario list in it, but also has detailed information about what we're expecting the participants to do. So it tries to guide them in or lead them in how they can guide discussions of the participants or observe actions and how they can most effectively lead the exercise or evaluate the exercise as they take part watching the participants. So we've said a couple times that it is useful to have a number of different participants around the table, but I wanted to spend a second to say a specific word about this. Again, there's been a big push in the last number of years to try and get away from siloed planning, where each agency has an extensive emergency operations plan of its own that doesn't have much relation to its neighbor or partner agency plans. So exercises also, for the most part, should be broadly based and intra-agency in their representation whenever possible. It is very, very helpful to have all the relevant partners at the table with whom you expect to collaborate during disaster response, because it's only when they're there that you can find out where your expectations of what they would be doing or their expectations of what you would be doing are incorrect. So multi-jurisdictional, multi-specialty representation is desirable, even though it's hard to do. It's, again, hard to get all these people together. No one has unlimited time. Sometimes it's expensive for backfill for certain public safety and other personnel. But whenever possible, broad-based representation, lots of different types of specialties, lots of jurisdictions that are adjacent to one another are really a good idea. However, as you try and get broad-based representation, what you may find oftentimes is one agency may send the head, the president, the CEO, whomever, the captain, the chief, and one sends someone quite junior, a new intern or an assistant or an entry-level person. And it's very hard to have those people participate equally in an exercise. Certainly it's useful to have the frontline staff participate in an exercise because they know things about response that oftentimes leadership may not. But vice versa, leadership may understand plans, resources, and constraints better than some of the frontline staff and can offer something different for the exercise. The challenge is when you don't clearly specify in exercise participation what level of participant you're looking for. Having someone very senior play with someone very junior oftentimes is frustrating to both and means that the kinds of discussions they have won't be similar because they're operating at different levels. So you should try and get people roughly at appropriately the same level of seniority. And no matter whom you get, you do have to make sure that they can act in the role they play during an exercise. If you have someone represent a public health agency who doesn't really understand the emergency response capabilities of the agency, they may make some misleading or some challenging statements about the public health agency's response that their partners in the hospitals, in community health centers, in EMS may take as policy, and therefore may actually introduce confusion into the community's response. The controllers and facilitators that you have in the exercise really are there to make sure that the participant's experience is the best that it can be. They monitor the script, the master scenario events list, and they monitor the timeline to make sure people are on pace to achieve their objectives. Their job is to make sure the action and the pressure keeps coming. Again, someone who's bored starts to make phone calls or check their email and doesn't get as much out of the exercise. But they also, your controllers and evaluators, have to be quite knowledgeable about participants' expected actions and skills. If they don't know what they should expect to see, if they don't know what kinds of actions are desirable or undesirable behaviors, an exercise can quickly go off track. And so you do need to select controllers and facilitators with enough expertise in the area so that they can know about the quality of the response they're seeing in front. They also ideally should be pretty good with their interpersonal skills. It is common, especially during discussions-based exercises, to have some disagreement or some conflict between participants. And if you don't have someone who can moderate that conflict or help them get to positive solutions, again, you can have bad interactions, and ultimately, sometimes you can have some hard feelings linger after an exercise. In full-scale exercises, you may need to recruit volunteers to act as simulated victims. Sometimes they get moulaged. Again, they get makeup applied that look like simulated injuries. Depending on the size of the exercise you're conducting, you may need large numbers of victims. A lot of folks use different volunteer groups in the community as part of their community service to act as volunteers and victims. It's really important for a lot of reasons to prepare them ahead of time to participate in your exercise. And you don't want to coach them about the emergency operations plan, because certainly the public isn't pre-coached in our emergency operations plans before events happen. But they do need to understand the limits of exercise participation. They need to know for their own safety how to ask for help or how to call off the exercise when appropriate. And so they should get some coaching before they participate, just to, again, ensure that people don't act out a bit too much for an exercise trying to earn their Oscar, but unfortunately making others unsafe around them as they do so. It is actually sometimes very helpful to have your responders act as volunteers or victims. It's remarkable the perspective you can get on your own emergency response plan when you act as a volunteer or victim, and oftentimes we'll encourage people at some point during the planning process to go through as a volunteer or victim, at least for one exercise. But again, put limits on this. We should never injure people during disaster response exercises, and sometimes people get so excited about the exercise that they end up at risk for that. Lastly, your evaluators are absolutely critical in an emergency exercise, and it's because they're the ones who are trying to capture data about the events unfolding in front of them. So they obviously have to be content experts. They have to know what they're seeing so that they can give it an appropriate grade. But most people think that the evaluators also should be given the right tools to document what they're seeing in front of them. Even a very experienced evaluator with good content knowledge with a blank sheet of paper is less useful than an experienced evaluator with a structured evaluation tool that helps him or her know what they're looking for, what the objectives are, what the expected actions are, and allows them means of quantifying and documenting their evaluations so that such evaluations can be compared across different jurisdictions and against different response agencies. It's important to notice, though, that your evaluators, while they're meant to document all the things they see in front of them, really have some inherent contradictions that are placed on them during exercise evaluation. The first relates to one of the early topics we mentioned earlier in this talk about the educational versus evaluative use of exercises. Again, if an agency or if a community is using a full-scale exercise to train large numbers of its staff, evaluators have to recognize that any component of the exercise that's meant to train staff really shouldn't be evaluated. Again, training activities don't represent the emergency plan, the emergency response fairly, and those have to be thought of differently than portions of the exercise that are really meant to be truly evaluative. Also, it is important to understand that in all exercises there really is a tension between accountability and performance improvement. When you test your emergency operations plans, you would like to be able to say to those above you, whether it's state government, federal government, your funders, or even the public, that you did well, that most responders would like to do well in their test, to do well in their exercise, and therefore there is an incentive and a bias to documenting perhaps better than observed performance when you are looking at accountability reasons for evaluation. But this is very much in contrast to performance improvement, where ideally you conduct exercises because you want to find problems. The more things that you can find that went wrong during an exercise, the better, because that way you can fix your plans and you can actually improve your system even more. So the tension between accountability, which makes you want to have a good score on your evaluation, and performance improvement, which in some sense wants you to have a bad score, or at least find lots of problems in your evaluation, that tension is real. And your evaluators have to both be aware of it and have ways of resolving it so that ideally, again, you will show that you're meeting the needs of your of those to whom you report, but also you are improving your emergency plan, and each year you're getting better. Secondly, you really need to make sure that your evaluators understand the difference between evaluation of the quality of the drill and the performance of drill objectives. Even well-designed exercises have problems in their conduct, and it's certainly important to recognize those, document them, learn from them, so that each time you conduct an exercise, hopefully you get better at actually conducting exercises. But just because something goes wrong in an exercise as part of its conduct doesn't necessarily mean that evaluation of the participants' achievement of objectives should suffer. So it's really important to know when your participants are executing their plans well and document that, or executing their plans poorly and document that, but draw a distinction between how the participants are performing in their performance of capabilities and how the exercise is functioning as an independent event. Lastly, when you're evaluating, most people are pretty aware of the fact that it's kind of hard to standardize objective measures of performance. So if I evaluate community A as they respond to a train crash with a chemical spill, if I use the exact same evaluation instrument at community B, but community B is twice as large or it's half as large, it's hard for me to know whether they should get exactly the same score, higher or lower score, because communities can be so different in size and capability, even when you give them the same threat. So we're still struggling with this at a national and at an academic level, but I would encourage folks to use some of the best tools that are out there, and we'll talk a little bit about that actually in just a second. No matter what you're trying to evaluate for, or how you're trying to resolve the tensions we discussed, you need to use a lot of data to try and make sure you're collecting data about the exercise performance in as comprehensive a fashion as possible. And different ways in which you can get evaluation data come from hot washes or debriefing sessions. They're not quite the same thing, and we'll talk about that. You can get evaluations from the participants themselves. Those are very, very helpful. You can look at pre-specified criteria. Again, these are usually measures that you give to your evaluators that describe whether or not the participants met the objectives. Of course, you do use expert observers, and there are actually other ways of collecting data as well. So one of the first ways that you can get evaluation data is through hot washes and debriefing. Hot washes are conducted immediately after the exercise, and it's your chance to get feedback from the participants right when all the exercise activities are fresh in their mind. It allows you to get their thoughts about what went wrong, some suggestions they think of what they think could go better, or alterations to the plan that should happen. But the purpose of a hot wash is really to just let folks vent, to get out their thoughts and their experiences. And usually it's a little bit unfocused, but it's oftentimes very, very helpful just because of the immediacy with relation to the exercise. A hot wash is a little bit different than a debriefing. A debriefing is a little more formal, and usually what it involves is some collating of exercise evaluation before the debriefing so that the participants, the planners, the facilitators, the controllers, and the evaluators can all come together after they've had a chance to think about what happened in the exercise and then share their experience. Again, usually a debriefing is a little bit more removed from the actual time of conduct of the exercise because of the time for reflection that can oftentimes be a very useful way to evaluate an exercise, but sometimes, again, you lose out on those participant experiences because time passes and those immediate thoughts that they had fade. I mentioned before that it's very important to use structured tools to gather evaluation data when you're evaluating an exercise. Your evaluator should not have a blank sheet of paper. And there are a number of different ways to do this. One of the ways that's out there is something called an Exercise Evaluation Guide, or EEG. And the EEGs that currently exist are created within the HSEEP program, and most of them are based on the federal government's list of target capabilities, and they're meant to be used by evaluators for evaluation of exercises. The good parts of EEGs are that they are standardized, and therefore they can be used across lots of different jurisdictions and organizations, and really they're meant to be used with common capabilities as described by the federal government so that everyone's measuring against the same baseline. The problem with EEGs from a public health and healthcare perspective is that the target capabilities list that the federal government has, as well as the EEGs themselves, really are not commonly focused on public health and health objectives. So oftentimes they need to be adapted from the public safety objectives, for which they're much more well-suited to be used in public health or health exercises. There is a lot of work going on. The CDC recently released public health capabilities that are complementary to but different from the target capabilities list. And there are others that are working on creating crosswalks between EEGs and public health capabilities, and certainly There are a number of academic researchers, our center's specifically part of this, working on other ways to evaluate public health and health exercises using public health response capabilities from the CDC. I think more will evolve over the next couple of years to let us better document using a common vocabulary what we see in public health and health exercises. The after action report, again, provides a summary of the exercise itself. When was it held? How many people were there? Some of the basic logistical issues. But more importantly, it describes the participants' experience in trying to achieve the objectives, in trying to demonstrate the capabilities that were to be tested during the exercise. So a well-written after-action report really details the experience, names the challenges that were observed, names best practices that were observed. It's not purely a critical document, but it's meant to be one that shares both the best practices and the common challenges, and tries to highlight areas that need to be improved. Those problems, those areas that need to be improved, should be collated in an improvement plan. And what an improvement plan is really a punch list of things to do. So if I saw that calling my staff off hours was a problem, the improvement plan should list that I'm responsible for finding a different way to call staff off hours that works 24/7, 365. The improvement plan should say who needs to do the actions expected. So if I'm not going to be the one fixing the call list, who is? And it should set a target date for when things should be completed so that, again, exercises don't simply name problems that never are addressed. Instead, exercises result in after-action reports that name specific plans and an improvement plan that identifies who's responsible and when those problems will be fixed, so that after each exercise, ideally, concrete and measurable improvements are made, and overall the preparedness system gets better. So ultimately what this slide does is it just summarizes what the different steps are in the exercise evaluation and improvement process. The one thing I would highlight from this slide is step one here, where it says plan and organize the evaluation. That really is meant to be at the same time you're planning the initial onset of the exercise. So when you start to think about having an exercise, you should start planning your evaluation right as you set your objectives, right as you start to begin to think about the scenario and the script. All too commonly, people get all the way to the end of the exercise process. They have come up with some objectives, they've written a script, they've invited participants, they've set the date, they've even named a caterer, and then they start to think about evaluation. And really, unfortunately, that significantly limits your evaluation process. The scenario that you write, even the objectives that you write, need to be created with an eye to evaluation so that you know you will be able to evaluate what you're trying to observe. Otherwise, again, if it gets shoehorned in at the end, it usually is suboptimal. I would encourage you all to access and submit to LLIS. LLIS is the Lessons Learned for Information Sharing, and it's a Department of Homeland Security resource where after-action reports and other lessons learned from exercises and real-world events should be submitted. The intent of LLIS is that all of us can learn from each other's experiences. None of us has enough time to conduct every exercise for every event we want to, and thankfully none of us has to go through every kind of emergency before we learn lessons about that experience. So there are a great number of after-action reports up there on LLIS. And then I would encourage you all to get access to the system. It does require registration, but to go through it, learn lessons from your similar agencies and partner agencies, and ultimately submit your own after-action reports to LLIS so that others can learn from your experience as well. So to sum up, I think there really are a couple common pitfalls that we've seen others have again and again, and exercises we've been a part of have had some of these pitfalls. I think if you can try and avoid these pitfalls, your exercise program is much more likely to be successful. The first is exercising without a plan. And it really is dogma that you shouldn't be exercising unless you know what part of your plan you're going to test. It's unfortunately kind of common for people to say, hey, here's a threat, we don't have a plan, let's have an exercise and then we'll come up with a plan. And what unfortunately that means is that the exercise itself is usually of pretty limited utility for evaluation, and frequently creates quite a bit of frustration for the participants themselves, and again can often be demotivating. So really it is dogma, but I would encourage you to follow it. You got to have a plan if you're going to conduct an emergency preparedness exercise, because you're grading your evaluation against that plan. Secondly, you shouldn't exercise without a bigger exercise program behind it. Again, HSEEP requires you to have a multi-year training program, but I encourage you to do that so that your exercises are linked together, the evaluation, the lessons you learn are linked together, and it drives your preparedness forward in a concerted fashion. Again, a number of one-off exercises can be frustrating for participants and certainly limit the amount of lessons you can learn. Don't exercise in a vacuum. What does that mean? That means use your partners. Don't exercise just your own internal agency or department plans again and again and again without involving your partner agencies, your neighbors, your other jurisdictions, everyone you would realistically be responding with. If you keep simulating what others would do, you're likely to be wrong in your assumptions of what their capabilities or their plans are. So we really encourage multi-regional and multidisciplinary exercising. It is common not to leave enough time for planning. I've already mentioned that, but full-scale exercises can take a year or more to plan, and even tabletop exercises oftentimes take months. And you've got to leave enough time for planning to make sure that all the right partners are at the table, the right level of seniority, all the appropriate details of exercise planning are attended to. You can't have too many objectives. I love 5 as a number. I certainly don't like anything more than 10. But I think an appropriately limited number of objectives is one of the keys to a good exercise. Having the wrong attendees there, what do I mean by that? Well, you really do want as many people as you can get there in a lot of ways. Again, I don't mean to suggest you should limit the partner agencies or the partner regions that should be limited. But again, if you have somebody who's very senior next to somebody who's very junior, or worse yet, someone who just doesn't know anything about the plan they can't represent their agency. They're not going to help the other participants to have a good exercise. It's hard to find enough people with expertise and time to be facilitators and evaluators. But if you don't have enough, if you don't have enough facilitators, participants will frequently get bored or lose interest or kind of drift off on their own. And if you don't have enough evaluators, you can't capture the data you need to learn. And so you will have wasted that opportunity. It's hard. What I would suggest to a lot of people is create cadres of facilitators and evaluators that are shared among lots of different exercises. So when one region is exercising, they can call on their partners from other regions to come in and facilitate and evaluate, and then that can be reciprocated when other regions need to have their exercises. But even though it's hard to identify these people, try as hard as you can not to skimp on either facilitators or evaluators. After action reports, they're tough. We talked about the purpose of them before, but they often end up watered down because no one likes to have a written report that looks like it's criticizing an agency or naming lots and lots of problems because we're all afraid it'll make us look bad. And therefore, after-action reports oftentimes lack specifics. They are simply a collection of platitudes about emergency response that everyone tried their best and really worked hard. And I would encourage you not to write those. I think you can put in as many caveats as you'd like at the beginning that this was an exercise you were trying to find fault, you were really trying to work hard, and you were very successful in finding fault, and try and spin it that way. But and after-action reports really should be specific because otherwise your improvement plan can't be specific and you're not going to make measurable change. Likewise, even if your improvement plan is specific but you don't actually follow through and attack the problems you notice in your improvement plan, then your participants will start to notice that their exercising isn't really helping improve the overall agency or regional preparedness, and they'll be demotivated. So I encourage you to be very specific in your after-action reports, to be very specific in your improvement plan, and to track implementation of improvement plan actions, because that's the only way the system will get better. So to wrap up, what are really the take-home points from the talk today? First, exercises are important. And I think everyone has started to recognize this much more than they already did in the last number of years. But good exercise really takes a lot of planning and a lot of attention to detail to do it right. Exercises shouldn't be conducted independent of one another. They really need to be part of a multi-year program. They should build on both your hazard vulnerability analysis and your latest planning efforts, but also build on previous lessons learned and changes to your plan to make sure that the changes you're making are pointed in the right direction. You should try and include your regional partners, your partner agencies, your neighbors whenever possible, because that's how response goes. We rely on these people when the real world events happen, and it's much better to work with them ahead of time than to create false assumptions about what they might do or what their actions might be. And lastly, evaluate your exercises, but do it as carefully as you possibly can. Conducting an exercise that doesn't capture specific data about how well capabilities were performed is a lost opportunity. So give your evaluators structured evaluation tools that are thoughtful, collate that data into after-action reports, and feed that all forward into your improvement plan. And I think then you'll be very happy with how your exercise program is helping you achieve your preparedness goals. Thank you for your time listening to this talk, and I wish you all the best in your exercising in the future.